button here? Yeah. Oh. Well, good morning, everyone. Well, I hope you have sufficient caffeine in your systems. It's 10 a.m. on a Saturday, so we're impressed to see so many of you here. And rumor has it that some of you were out last night scouting for places to go out dancing, while I responsibly went back to my hotel room, tucked myself in, and just stared at the ceiling for a few hours. Pretty ceiling with all of the original works. And I was thinking about the title of this session, Creating Communities Around Critical Beats. Really catchy, and I did come up with it, and I thought, what exactly does that mean? So for the purposes of this conversation today, what it means is communities of dedicated audiences, communities of different types of media, of different sizes, formats, focus areas, and geographies, and communities of different media development actors, freedom of speech advocates, media innovation experts, foundations, and those of us who are trying to create a more resilient media landscape in different contexts. And so we're going to be addressing the roles of these communities in our current capacities. So Yasser Khan as CEO at the Context newsroom at Thomson, editor-in-chief, my mistake, editor-in-chief at the Context newsroom at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and Jackie will be talking as the media innovation lead at International Press Institute, and I will be providing some observations from Report for the World, which is a global journalism service program. And so, Yasser, if I may start with you, you set up the Context newsroom, which is a very specific part of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and you decided to focus on three specific verticals: tech and society, climate, and inclusive economies. Could you talk us through this decision to focus on these particular areas?
Sure. So the Thomson Reuters Foundation's newsroom has existed for quite a while, and our initial remit, or our original remit, was we would do journalism on very, very focused donor-funded topics, and those stories would go to the Thomson Reuters Newswire, and we had a 3-person web desk that would go into those stories and go Control-A, Control-C, go into the CMS, Control-V, and publish. And that was the extent of our digital participation. The reason why we launched Context was because we realized that as TRF, we do very, very specific work, but we didn't have an idea of who was reading that. And also our product wasn't very distinct from the rest of Reuters' news coverage. And that we also realized that not only did we need to figure out who was reading us and what they wanted out of our content, but also what we didn't need to do any longer. The first thing we did was cut out all of our spot news, which was 300-word what and where stories, and focused on, and used, which meant that our correspondents now had time to focus deeply on stories. So all of our stories are in-depth, and in-depth coverage of 3 types of stories. One is stories that are news-led, and how can we get in with our own angles on, say, for example, Taliban get into Kabul, get back into Kabul. What is the story that we're going to tell that is going to stand out from the regular news coverage? What is going to be the second or third read on that topic? Or crypto, what is going to be the second or third read on that topic? And then, what that did for us was give our correspondents the time and space to spend on a story, to give people, as our name suggests, the context, because we feel that there's a lot of news out there, but not a lot of context. And we are trying to fill that hole. The other reason why we focused on these 3 topics is because A, there's a lot of funding for them, and B, because this is where our in-house expertise had sort of gravitated towards, and C, because that is what we discovered our audiences were coming to us for. Climate, obviously, it's the biggest story in the world. The more context we can provide on things like net zero and heat risks and climate risks, the better. Inclusive economies, because that is also work that we do in terms of socioeconomic inequality, modern slavery, et cetera, on our corporate side. And so we had resident expertise on that. Tech and society, because again, it's one of the biggest stories in the world, digital rights, data privacy, surveillance, and these stories lend themselves very, very much to deeper contextual coverage. What we also discovered that our USP is not in doing individual climate stories or socioeconomic inequality stories or tech and society stories, but stories that intersect. So a climate story that also is a socioeconomic inequality story, or a socioeconomic inequality story that is also a digital rights and data privacy story. So that is where we're finding the meeting of our Venn diagram, and those are the stories that our audiences are connecting with. Again, traditionally, we were a very traditional newsroom where we got into a room every morning and decided what stories we're going to tell the world. But now we have an audience team that tells us what are the conversations that we can start that are going to get traction, but also what are the conversations out there that we can meaningfully add to. Because to me, those are the only two reasons to do a story, either to start a conversation or to add to an existing conversation in a meaningful way. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. That's a good introduction to what you're doing. And while your setup is unique, it's also part of a larger trend, especially among global local media, to cover specific themes because they have unique access. And Jackie, you're working with a number of independent media that are doing exactly that, focused thematic reporting. And a large part of your effort is to, I guess, create sustainability around this reporting. And you formed the local news network as part of these efforts. Could you tell us what the mission of the network is and how does it operate?
Sure. So the mission is really to grow sustainable, independent journalism. Of course, in a free media environment. And I think if I can just go a step back and say, IPI, the International Press Institute, is itself a global network of journalists, editors and publishers. And it's, it has a long history. It was started in 1950. And I'd like to think that, of course, we're, rolling with the changes that we've all been through. But we come together because we recognise that we're much stronger. We can speak with a stronger voice when we come together and build that solidarity. But we can also leverage the expertise and the wisdom that's in that network across continents and countries. And so that really informs, everything that we do. So we started back in 2020. We could see, obviously that local media particularly was being at the coalface of the disruption, was really the most disrupted, and we felt that it was also had the greatest promise, for pointing the way for how we can reimagine journalism and rebuild sustainable media. So we, began a series of conversations within our network with our members and with, local media globally. And, there's some incredible work being done. There's not one model, I don't think. Media are innovating in, reacting to the conditions in which they exist. And so that's been really interesting because you can actually pull innovations out, say from Africa, and they can be picked up elsewhere where people might not have thought of that. But what we found particularly was that, in some parts of the world, there's great support for local media and for small, newsrooms to build. And, there's, particularly in the US, obviously, and in Northern Europe, if you're trying to build something really interesting, then there's a lot of support, around understanding, sponsorship, reader revenues, product, a whole lot of things. But that is not evenly distributed. And so that's really what I guess, we took away from, more than 80 newsroom conversations. And we thought, well, how can we actually make a difference? And really we felt that by bringing all of those media together in a community and thinking about how do we level up that access to expertise and knowledge, because it really exists. We all have, knowledge of different areas that we can share. So that's what our local news network is. There's a Slack channel where everybody comes together and can have their, individual conversations and collaborations. We do trainings. We nourish that with workshops, with lots of speakers. We have newsroom visits, which is very interesting and useful. I find that we will drop in virtually to a newsroom and take a group of journalists in, and over an hour have a conversation about how did they build it, what are the challenges, how are they thinking about things. And the most recent newsroom visits were to the continent in Africa and to the News Minute in southern India. And so, like for the continent, they're distributing a WhatsApp, via WhatsApp, a magazine across the African continent. And they've built it from scratch. So through the pandemic, they could see that, so much disinformation was being spread, of course, on messaging platforms. Well, why not use those platforms to actually tell this, I guess bring truth-based journalism? And a couple of founders who, were avid foreign correspondents and didn't feel that that was available in Africa. Most of the media routes through London or through New York. So they thought, how could we do this via WhatsApp? So that meant kind of really reimagining journalism, right? Because if you're doing a WhatsApp-sized newspaper or magazine, you can't have 700-word stories. Like they have to be shrunk down to 300 words. So that's quite hard. But it's really interesting that somebody's thinking about how to do that, right? And what can we learn? It also solves another problem, which is, people's attention, time that they have. So to concentrate on journalism. And But I think one of the most interesting things that came out of that conversation, for me particularly, is that they, one of the ways that they had dealt with, this incredible strain on resources, and how do you avoid burnout, how do you find time in small newsrooms to think about strategy and to solve some of the problems that you're encountering. So they started publishing in seasons. So they would do 4 seasons a year and take a few weeks off in between. And, so those kind of lessons, like I had never thought about that, but why not?
And that's really interesting when you mentioned WhatsApp-based news coverage. We have at least 2 media that are doing that. Agência Mural in Brazil, because they're trying to reach a specific community in Sao Paulo, and our partner Citizen Bulletin in Zimbabwe, because they have a rural audience that is plugged into WhatsApp. So the local news network would be a great place for them to come in and say what is working for your format. So, but with a slightly different approach, but similar mission and values, we at Report for the World support full-time salaried positions of reporters, again, working on critical areas such as climate change, gender, corruption, criminal justice, healthcare, etc. And we're now actually in 20 countries. We just expanded this week, so it's a really incredible time for us in terms of growth. And if we can just pull up the map, we can see the countries in which we're present. And so in addition to supporting these reporting roles, I think our technical crew is maybe on break, but we'll just find them. There we go. And so alongside supporting the salaried positions of these reporters, what we do is we look at different areas that we just have been discussing the last days about how they're building these communities. So the 3 broad ones that we'll be touching upon today are engagement, collaborations, and professional development. So we can look at, I did a little mapping based on conversations with our newsroom partners. If we can pull up the second image, and we won't have the time to look at all of them today, but if we can look at the three main ones. So we can start with, I guess, engagement. And we're talking about engagement with audiences at different levels. And so what we're seeing with our newsrooms is that they often reach niche audiences, or they look at policymakers or more active recipients of the news stories, and through them they reach larger mainstream audiences that would otherwise not pay attention. An example that comes to mind is iStories, our Russian media partner in exile, also member of IPI, that investigated a story about war crimes being committed by the Russian military in a specific region of Ukraine. And they supplied that information to Ukrainian prosecutors and the ICC. So they got attention at a much higher level, and that translated to over 2 million views via YouTube. So along that line of thinking, Yasser, you are focused on very specific areas, and how have you seen that impact the type of audiences you reach? Who are they? Are they more engaged?
Well, I think in my thinking, audiences aren't built when the story happens. Audiences are built when you recruit, right? Recruiting journalists within the communities from which you want them to report and bring out local stories of global relevance for us is key. So for instance, we recently hired our Inclusive Economies correspondent, Marija Ramos, in the Philippines, and we hired her from the Philippines National Enquirer. And she knows her beat, and she knows the community. She has stakes in the community that she lives in, and she's been reporting on certain stories for a very long time. So she already has an active audience who follow her work. Our Inclusive Economies editor, Amruta Biatnal, who's sitting right there in the audience, we recently hired her in New Delhi, where she's been doing consequential work on socioeconomic inequality as it relates to public health, and especially in light of COVID. One of the things that we had asked for during the recruitment was that not only the candidates give us a critique of our current work, but also give us a vision for the file that they are going to be editing. And the reason why Amrita's file stood out is because we hadn't even considered public health in terms of coverage, because we didn't have the in-house expertise to cover that. But out comes this vision for the file, and we thought this is actually a big deal, and here's a person with a track record of covering this topic and has roots in the society in which she has covered this, and she hasn't been parachuted in, and can tell these stories compellingly, but also make it relevant to a more global audience. So the whole idea is to bring out stories from journalists who live and work within the communities that they're reporting on, but can bring out those local stories that have a global relevance. So that's the recruitment side. And then the story is the story, but on the distribution side, we have explored partnerships with things such as Mozilla Pocket, which is very big in India, because the silent majority of the Indian audiences have read the tea leaves and have read the writing on the wall about a lot of Indian media coverage about issues in India, and we realize they are hungry for impartial, unvarnished coverage of Indian issues. And what they're doing is they're signing up to outfits like Mozilla Pocket, where they can save stories from global news publishers that are relevant to them, and then read them later. And as a result, we've seen our Indian audience, start to ratchet up. But for instance, our Lagos correspondent, Bukola Adebayo, who I would totally take a bullet for, is experiencing the cash shortage that she is reporting on in Lagos. And so the reporting becomes really interesting, but also when we publish that story, how we publish that story, on what platforms we take that story to, determines that story actually gets back to the community that she's reporting on. So we are seeing an uptick in readership from these audiences that we historically haven't had. Historically, our audiences were whatever the Reuters Newswire audiences were, or whichever newspaper picks up our story and publishes it. And we had a very blunt way of tracking that, but now we can be a lot more forensic about who's reading our story and whether or not our audiences in the Global South, in the English-speaking Global South, are going up, and they are.
And the way you're gaining those engaged audiences, they're also extremely valuable in countries with where media laws are regressing and where governments are clamping down, especially on independent media. And since we're talking about India, Jackie, you were in India recently and you visited some of the key newsrooms that have been sort of called into questioning or being intimidated and harassed. Some of our common partners again, The Scroll, The Wire, The News Minute. How are they plugging into new networks and building coalitions both on the ground and virtually? And why is this coalition building really important in this period?
So I think digital media has been much more targeted by the government, I think, in the sort of that trying to control the media there. The bigger sort of older legacy media is much more easily controlled through government advertising. So advertising is like about 40% of the income of most of those media. And also if they're making money off events, then having government, representatives at your events is what ensures, that they're bringing the revenue. So for corporate media, it's a bit easier for the government, and so they've seen, there's legislation that's been brought in about digital media have to have like a public editor who will answer virtually any complaint from the public. So you can just see that they get totally tied up, dealing with that. So there's a whole lot of things. There's a kind of a campaign of lawfare constantly. There's criminal defamation continues there. There's a lot of, business raids, constantly, having to be audited and come up with documents. So there's a lot of, they're operating in a really difficult environment, and it's getting ratcheted up. So they formed, the digital media formed a group called DigiPubs. And I think that's been really important because it's given them a way, it's given all of this, and there's probably 100+ members. So you could see there was a real need that people flocked to it, and it just gives them a voice and a way to have the conversations and strategize and things like that. I'd say though that in India there has been also a long-standing network of women journalists, which has been very active and has served that community very well. And in terms of the local media, one of the local initiatives that has had a big impact in India has been the Independent and Public Spirited Media Foundation, which is a grant-giving organisation for journalists, for media, I should say, and it was set up by a group of journalists who went around to wealthy people, impressed upon them the need to support the kind of growth of new media, and they managed to put this fund together. And so they get through that 3 years runway with declining, contribution from the fund, but it gives them time to figure out what is, how can they be sustainable? What kind of business models? A lot of runway, I guess, to experiment with that, and that has had a huge impact, I would say, in India.
Right, and that actually reminds me of a different type of an example where across the border in Pakistan, our media partner, the Tribal News Network, they're doing something similar in terms of not just building sort of these associations, but also really nurturing the news generations of journalists. So they are in some of the hardest to reach rural parts of Pakistan along the border with Afghanistan, historically absent in the mainstream media. And they've been training I think they have about 35 trained reporters in these areas, majority of them women, some from migrant and displaced communities, Afghans in particular, and some with LGBTQ identities. And so when they're on the ground, they're also changing sort of the culture of journalism there and how people consume media. So that is then translating to a lot of followers on their social media. So they get tens of thousands of new followers every month. And so there's been a great uptick in that sort of momentum. And these are communities that would normally not consume media digitally. They just wouldn't, they aren't consuming any sort of journalism. So along those lines, I mean, that's a very specific type of professional development. But obviously, you are engaged on the job with professional development of these journalists because over time they become subject experts. And so how are you seeing that impact the depth of their coverage compared to what a, sort of a general service would be able to accomplish?
Look, when we give journalists the time and space to cover stories deeply, not only do they become subject matter experts, but they develop the sources that are necessary to go back to all the time. They develop connections with the communities that they report on. And that is important to us because then we can relentlessly report on a particular story and own it. So for instance, at TRF, even before Context was launched, for 3 years, we covered modern slavery as a thing. Not only did we build a team around covering modern slavery issues, but also we did a lot of legal research and other types of research in Brazil, in India, and in Bangladesh along the lines of modern slavery. And what that did was it really centered the TRF newsroom as an authority on that particular topic. But then because the nature of the funding changed, we had to pivot from modern slavery to what we are calling just transition. How we are moving people from climate polluting economies like coal in India to greener economies in a just manner with the same team. And so the team had to very, very quickly pivot to a just transition type of output. However, that work that they had done on modern slavery fed directly into the just transition stories because, for instance, we did this huge investigation into slavery conditions on sugarcane farms in Brazil. Our correspondent in Rio, Fabio Teixeira, who was a modern slavery correspondent, turned into a just transition correspondent, but his story was slave-like conditions on sugarcane farms in Brazil that supply a large chunk of the ethanol that is mixed into the gasoline in the US market, right? So there's the professional development in one beat did not necessarily, cut him off from, developing that beat into his current beat. So, but what helped that is the time and space that he needed to do these investigations. So we're a small newsroom, and in terms of professional development, what is very difficult to do in small newsrooms is to move people up, right? People, and we think of these things, rather than retention, we think more of succession, all right? What is the lifespan of somebody in our newsroom, and how can we sort of keep that cycle going of good expert quality news coverage by correspondents. However, we're finding that people love the work so much that they're sticking around for a lot longer than 2 years because the stories are so great and they're getting the time and space to sink their teeth into their stories. But also, they're getting to collaborate with colleagues across the world, from Bangkok to Bogota, on key stories. So when we do a story on gig work, in India, that is not just relevant to India, it is also relevant to the Philippines, it is also relevant to Colombia, it is also relevant to South Africa. And while you're not moving up in title, what you are doing is you're getting to do more and more of that type of work and grow the audiences to your stories by leaning on your colleagues who have similar stories to tell from wherever they are. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question that you asked?
Absolutely, because it gives the reporters the time between the periods between the peaks of the news cycles to be able to see what the stories, where the story is going, and to be able to link it across borders.
Exactly. So what we're aiming in terms of our output, our target is that about 30% of our output should be news and trends led, which will help us build, those audiences who are already having those conversations that are important to them, and we're adding to them in a meaningful way. But between 60 to 70% of our coverage needs to be enterprise and stories that we own. And so that is the goal of the editors. And about 10% would be what I call the Hey Martha stories, as in stories that we, Singapore making beer out of sewage water. Like, hey Martha, come take a look at this story type of, but, the stories that won't go anywhere beyond that. But, the key focus for us would be stories that we can own and report relentlessly on and deeply on over a course of time, and involve correspondents, do a collaboration between the South African correspondent and the Mexican correspondent. We're currently doing one story on feminine hygiene and tampon taxes. But that is not only relevant to our correspondent in Mexico City, where the story originated, but it's also relevant to our India correspondents and our correspondent in Nairobi and also in Lagos. And this has become a huge sort of cross-border story that all of these correspondents are contributing to. And I've been waiting for it to come out for a little while now, and I can't wait to read it. But while that sort of kind of collaboration takes time, what it does is it gives the reporters the time and space to report that story more fully, more globally.
And thank you for touching upon collaboration, which was the third part I was getting to. So since we started talking about that, it's a bit of what we're doing through peer-to-peer networks at Report for the World as well. So if there's a reporter, one of our core members in Lagos who's looking at rising sea levels and its impact, they will be able to sort of directly communicate with another core member who's working on the same topic in Rio, and to find those, sort of cross-border connections and seeing the links. But also north-south collaborations are super important. So if there are a group of reporters who are looking at environmental stories with supply chains that end up in European markets or households, sort of connecting them with global newsrooms that can take advantage of their proximity to these communities. And so I'm sure, Jackie, you're hearing a lot of those examples, and also examples of success and experiments from your media partners or media members, where they're trying to create not just more audiences, but also some level of revenue. It might not be at scale, but how do you monetize? How do you convince these more dedicated audiences to actually pay for the content? Why are certain things, sort of experiments, working, and how do you help them sort of systematize these outcomes? Because a lot of times they don't have the resources in their newsrooms to do it.
Yeah. So there's no one model, I find, after, so many conversations. But there's, there are some kind of, things that people rely on. I think all successful media, for example, know their audience. They understand what their audience is expecting from them. They find ways to engage them across the process chain, whether it's from, thinking about what kind of stories that we should be covering and from what angles, to actually involving them in the stories. And actually having a kind of a bias to experimentation, so a continuing experimentation in the newsroom, so that if something doesn't work, you move on and try something else. Many of them are actually really creating something very new as well. So, Preeti, you mentioned Kabalaharia in northern India, in Uttar Pradesh predominantly. It's a hyper-local media organisation that has completely redefined what it is to be a journalist, who gets to be a journalist, who gets to tell stories, and what kind of stories should they be telling. Because it's actually a network of women, so local women who have trained up on journalism, storytelling. They tell their stories on video. And that was something they had to create, really, that kind of culture where Is that
the one that they made the film on, Writing with Fire?
Yeah,
is that the one?
Yeah, exactly.
That film brought me to tears, and I remember saying to my wife, I miss journalism.
Like it really is incredibly brave because it used to be national organisations, if there was a big story, would helicopter in and tell the story and leave. But so what they bring, like they understand what their audience is expecting. They bring a very gendered lens to the storytelling. So, that's huge on issues, in villages, around crime and the like. Some communities cannot afford to pay for the journalism, and I think that's, so when we talk about, pivot to reader revenues and do this and that, like I think that we also need to be very clear that some communities just can't pay for journalism. So there is, that donors need to keep a focus on that. But also they're finding different ways to, different revenue streams. For example, they have, because they've got this expertise now in video, they do a lot of like videos for NGOs and other organisations, so that's a revenue stream. They also syndicate because they've got this very deep storytelling. They have like a group of editors in Delhi that, works across the different communities, and produces longer form stories that then get syndicated through, the Indian media. They've also now started an academy where they're training different groups of, women journalists, local Dalit women journalists in different communities. So that's a way that they're actually scaling that operation. So that's one example. I mean, obviously, diversified revenues, is the key, not only having one. The News Minute I mentioned earlier in southern India, so a local media, but local media on a different scale, right? Because it's covering the 5, now 6 states in the south. So, probably 300 million plus people. So they have newsrooms in the 5 cities, I think 5 major capitals. But they also saw that there was a gap, in telling these important stories from that part of India. Were being told mostly from Delhi, and they just weren't taken seriously. So they started the newsroom. Again, they bring a very gendered lens to the reporting, like a female lens, which is really important, I think, across a whole range of issues. But crime being one of the major ones. And what stands out, I think, from how they have approached their sustainability, because they're a for-profit company, is that they're constantly experimenting. So they actually thought a couple of years ago that they would try like a dual membership system. So for the diaspora living in the US and Middle East and elsewhere, they would offer one membership, which would be at a higher price and have a certain number of benefits, and then they'd have a local membership for their Indian audience. And they found that actually the people who were really rusted on and wanted to support them were the local audience, and the diaspora, where they thought they might make money, didn't actually work in the end. But so a series of experimenting led them to not thinking about it in terms of membership, but broadly audience revenue. So opening up as many channels as they could for people to either crowdfund around particular campaigns or stories, or membership, things like that. They also have an agency where they produce work for journalistic work. They do training for police in those states on how to approach policing across certain issues for women. So that's another. I mean, there's a whole lot. I'm happy to talk more. I don't know how much time we have though.
I think I'd love to open up for questions, but I thought I would just, a lot of the examples that the both of you provided are very much about the importance of creating communities. These communities might be hyper-local level, they might be, sort of a state in a country or an entire country. And actually, our partner citizen bulletin in Zimbabwe sent me an example this morning that I think fits really nicely with that concept. They had an environment-focused reporter investigating the impact of bricklaying, manufacturing bricks on a local community in rural Zimbabwe, including loss of biodiversity. So naturally in the beginning, she had a hard time getting the sources to the story because there were a lot of people involved in this activity, which was deemed illegal in this area. But over time, she was able to build that relationship with them where they created this WhatsApp group for only that community as part of an effort to build a relationship with them. And they started to subscribe to it and actually started sending them ideas, themes and topics that they thought should be covered. So they went from a very distrustful audience, because in Zimbabwe, the legacy media is extremely polarized, to actually engaging in the production of these stories, or in some editorial capacity, if you will. So community-driven journalism like this, we see, is very important in countries where there's very low trust in the media. For example, in India, and it's driven by the community, but it also strengthens the community that it's reporting about. So on that note, maybe we can open up to questions from audiences. Back there, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Rona Maya. I work for the Solutions Journalism Network. I manage the Africa Initiative. First of all, I want to say, yes, sir, I think you are quite modest, because I was one of the people that Context was surveying for quite some time in 2021 before the newsroom opened. I did always used to wonder, you guys would send us send us articles, we will read it, we had to fill this long ass form.
This is so cool.
Yeah, so I've always wondered about the other end of this process. What was that process like for you guys? What did you find out from us? Because I was just this lone person, but I was wondering what the other community members were.
Remind me what we asked you.
Oh, you guys sent us up to 15 articles over a month, and we were reading.
Thank you so much for doing that work.
Yeah, I mean, it's necessary. We can't complain about Global North, Global South if we're not helping to shape the news product. That's how I think of it. So I had to invest that time. So, yeah, just if you could just quickly tell me what that process was like from your end.
So the reason why we started that process was because we realized that we had a lot of output but very little feedback on what our target audience, which we define as purpose-driven professionals who are who work in the areas that we report on, or who have a connection to these areas like climate, inclusive economies, tech and society. We needed to get a sense of what kind of stories our target audience was engaging with, and what kind of stories what kind of feedback they wanted to give us in terms of how we told those stories. And this was, in the lead up to the launch of Context, months of content testing with people that our very, very tiny audience team had sort of found through either newsletter subscriptions or people who followed us on LinkedIn or other social platforms. So it involved a lot of sort of deep work in terms of picking, different cohorts, like we had several groups of these, people whom we tested our content with. We have 10 minutes left. Valentina's going to throw us out in 10 minutes, so I'll keep this short. And so that helped us decide not only our pillars of coverage, but what was the tone of voice and the depth to which our audience wanted us to, our target readers wanted us to get into. The other aspect of it was we had initially, before I came, we had thought that our audience was in Brussels, New York, Paris, London, the global north capitals, and that we were telling the stories of the global south to the global north. Bullshit. We wanted to develop our purpose-driven professionals exist in Nairobi, in Delhi, in Manila, in Bangkok, in Bogota. And we wanted to find out, and that's, I think, the reason we reached out to folks like you, is to figure out, what are you guys reading, and what do you like or don't like about what we're doing? Because it's important to me and to the team and to everybody now at Context, that we develop those purpose-driven professional readership. And those people I define as people who can print off one of our articles, walk into a boardroom and go, what can we do about this? We saw that when, for instance, we reported on forced labor in Thai prisons. And that the prisoners were being forced to make fishing nets for the US market. You must have read that story. I don't know if, thank you. And we, as a result of that story, that story went all the way to the US, and because of pressure from there, the Thai government, in writing, banned forced labor in Thai prisons, and there was legislation issued because of that story. I was surprised there was no legislation in the first place. But whatever, I think with stories like that, we developed, with work like that, with content testing like that, we developed a sense of what our audiences all over the world, be it global north or global south, were looking for in our coverage. And it was also selfish because, why invest resources in doing things that people are not going to read? If a story is published and nobody reads it, is it still a story? And so that was, before we launched Context, that was the thinking. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Sadia Zaman. I run a national foundation.
Hi, Sadia.
Hi, how are you? Nice to see you. I have one comment and then a very focused question. My first comment is just around the redefining journalism, and some of the work that is being done by Indigenous publications in Canada is really worth noting, and I'm happy to share some of that information with you. Highly gendered, highly very focused on decolonizing, and so without no surprises, lots of pushback as well, because they're doing things very, very differently, and it's kind of mind-blowing if you're coming from a traditional journalism background like I am. My question, though, is in terms of collaboration. One of the things that's quite common in the documentary world is the assignment of an impact producer. We're actually we're funding an initiative to train impact producers whose sole job is to get that documentary in front of legislatures, police unions, civil society, other actors, to actually move it beyond the story, because filmmakers are great at creating the story, but suck at actually getting the content out to the halls of power. Now, I understand the editorial issues here, but at the same time, documentary has a long history of doing this, and some of the best journalism that I've seen in the world is long-form documentary. And in terms of the impact to change things on a global level. And I'm wondering, when you talk about collaborations, whether you think about, does it extend beyond just newsrooms? Does it extend to not-for-profits and so on?
We're starting to see sort of cross-sector collaborations, if you will. So just as an example, one of our partners in the Philippines, they have a disinformation-focused reporter, and they teamed up that reporter with one of the world's leading experts on disinformation based in Harvard. And together they produced this show called Catch Me If You Can. And it was very witty. It reached a lot of local, national, and international audiences. And the person who was based in Harvard was able to activate different types of networks around that reporting. So that's one example. And in terms of actually impact, that's definitely a growing role that you're seeing in better resourced newsrooms. But they're very small niche ones like Ama Bungane in South Africa. They actually have a person, and they applied with this role to us, and we just weren't quite there to be able to support it, but I'd like to in the future. They had a person who would literally create the campaigns, the newsletters, and the advocacy, if you will, around their reporting. I don't see that as a conflict as much as an extremely valuable skill set to have. Now, if that person could also convert that into how do you look at more audience reaction equals revenue, that would take it an even step further. But there is a momentum in that direction. It's a little bit slow, though.
Hi, I'm Gabriela. I have a quick question. I'm a journalist, but I also work as a research analyst. In very many panels, people have been speaking about the difference between global North and global South, which is okay. However, as you might be well aware, there are many global North and many global South. So I was just wondering, how do you tackle with your initiatives these kind of shades of grey? It is very as we speak in right now, we in Italy. I don't know whether you're familiar with the editorial landscape as far as Italy is concerned. So there are very many differences if you compare the Italian editorial landscape with the Anglo-Saxon one, with the British one. So I was just wondering,
I'll really
how do you
quickly
tackle?
answer that and I don't know, Jackie, you might have some views on it, but we are most definitely looking to support media in Southern Europe, fully appreciating that there are independent media are struggling to operate, and even the RAI in Italy, I know, is not as well resourced as a Nordic state, entity would be. So the broad answer is the definition is evolving, it's changing. Is it Project Oasis that was put up by a bunch of different organizations, including European Journalism Center? It looked at news deserts across Europe. I was extremely surprised to find that it also included Northern Europe. So it's a ever-evolving notion, I suppose.
Yeah, and because we're a global network, so we, I guess, bring that global lens to it. And, as I said at the start, the big finding for us and the big problem we were trying to solve is how do we more evenly, distribute that support to media and to newsroom leaders to build sustainable journalism. But at the same time, what we know is that some of the most, incredible innovations are being done, outside of what, you call the global north. So the WhatsApp journalism, actually, it actually came about really in response to the high data costs in Africa. So that's an innovation that spurred, but that now, can be taken and picked up, say, in other places where, it's hard to get information out to communities, where journalism is under pressure. And equally in Italy, I'm a big fan, one of the local newsrooms I'm a big fan of is the Val di Police. I hope I'm saying that right. But they do a kind of slow journalism for their very small community, right? And they have a membership model, and it barely sort of covers the cost, but it is sustainable. And they produce a monthly magazine, I think it is. So they're not covering big issues, daily issues, but they do cover the big issues, like, for example, immigration. So, in Italy is a very contentious issue, whereas they devoted a whole, issue to understanding what it meant in their local community. And so that's, I just think that's a fabulous way to think about journalism as well.
I know we have 30 seconds, Valentina. I just wanted to add to it. I've always hated that word global north, that phrase global north and global south. I think it's lazy. I think it's catch-all. And I think as a Canadian journalist who's spent a lot of time working on First Nation stories in my country, which are in the north, that has been a term that has always bothered me. In our newsroom, I think we have these conversations about, whether or not to use this term or not. And I think that is a healthy thing to have those conversations. But I think in the calculus of deciding whether or not, what story we're going to do and why, I think the age-old, journalism maxim of, who benefits and who doesn't is must feature into your calculus of decide your editorial sort of discussion about what are we going to cover. And when I used to work at Al Jazeera, we used to have this saying that, everybody else comes to you from where the missiles are fired, we'll come to you from where they land. And I think that needs to be, for a newsroom like ours, I think that needs to be the sentiment, is that we center the people, who are being impacted by a certain issue, and that's where we tell the story from. Regardless of whether they live in Canada or whether they live in Joburg. Does that make sense? of course.
So all of that information and lots of case studies are available on the IPI website, ipi.media. And if there's any small newsrooms here, or if you know of some that would benefit from being part of the IPO local global network, then reach out.
And check out our work at context.news. Thank you.
Best radio voice.